you have an interesting kind of perspective because you've been in depth on the IT side, and you've also been in depth on the risk side. And often the two don't, whilst they're intricately connected, they don't tend to have someone who's worked both. And I find that a fascinating thing. And we were just talking about defense in depth, and I think you kind of, even called it out. You sit on both sides of those thinking perspectives there, Nathan. So tell me about that defense in depth and the experiences you've had working problems using both of those rationales.
Yeah, so what I find particularly interesting about the concept is it can mean entirely different things to entirely different people, so depending on which side of or which line of defense that you happen to be working in. So for instance, based on a conversation I had with a colleague recently, we were looking at a scenario where there was a range of systems that we'd been reviewing. And we found that, as you would expect, that there were some controls which were reasonably healthy by any objective standard, that were effective and mature, and others that were less mature and therefore had enormous opportunity for uplift. The colleague who I was speaking to, who was in the first line of defense, said to me that, well, if you look at that in aggregate, then we've actually got a very reasonable position. The preventative and detective controls in place are actually quite effective. And from their perspective, the conversation was one where they said, well, look, the urgency isn't there anymore because, we have a reasonable set of defenses in place. However, from the risk perspective, you take an entirely different approach to that argument, but my approach would rather be, well, yeah, whilst there are some reasonable defenses in place, it's what our concern is where those controls might be lacking, or whether it might be a lack of maturity, or there might be some opportunity for a threat actor to compromise those controls. So whilst it can be the kind of concept which allows people to say, well, we actually have a reasonable level of maturity, they can equally be used to say, well, you've actually got a lot of scope for maturity uplift because it's the gaps in those defenses that we're more concerned about. So I find it an interesting topic of conversation because the concept is the same depending on where you are within the organisation, but the connotation of that conversation can mean something completely different.
Yes, and this is what I guess we have as a theme that's developed as you and I have sort of intellectually sparred with each other and thrown around concepts and said, how do we question ourselves? I've been trying to get to the root cause of so many things, Nathan, and as you talk to more and more and more people, it becomes, I guess you get cluster points of kind of opinions. And I've spent a lot of time with CIOs of late and heads of technology. What that has done, it opens your mind to the non-cyber aspect of things, but it definitely also pulls us into the kind of questioning the risk. And there are some people who are so good at what they do that they are very singular in their approach and they are thorough and they achieve their uplift there. But what experience has taught me is there are always flaws that can be exploited because as complexity is so great and we are so human and systems are so distributed and complex, there will always be the problems, the things we don't see. Then we take the risk kind of guys who have a different set of agendas, as you say, and focus on their side. But rarely do I find someone that sits with that kind of thinking and then questions themselves so much. Is that something you've just really driven yourself inherently, or is it exposure to both areas? Where's the essence of that coming from?
Well, when I first went into risk, having come from the first line of defense, having spent most of my career in the technology division, I learned two things about risk people which have stuck with me. The first one was that a good risk person is pointy-elbowed, by which the person who said that to me means that you have to really be the kind of person who wants to get past the crowd and get in front of what's happening and look and understand and see what's happening at the coalface, so to speak. And the second thing I learned was that a good risk person must continue to ask questions until you actually understand. Right? And I think that what distinguishes somebody who's quite effective in risk versus someone who's less effective in risk. oftentimes the concepts in risk, when they're considered by highly technical people, they get a little bit mangled out of shape, and so things which might seem at face value a logical argument or a consistent evaluation of the risk actually skips or misses some key elements to mitigating that underlying risk. And so at face value, their argument might seem quite assuring that we have reasonable controls in place. But if you just have to ask a few simple questions, and often you find that what they had in mind was something different to what they were expressing, either in the way that they were writing or speaking. And so being able to continually ask questions and to ensure that you're actually talking about the same concept and you're thinking about it in the same way is important, because otherwise you get a false sense of security, and it ends with kind of reports to management that give a false sense of assurance. So I think it's those two things, right? Wanting to get in and understand what's happening. Don't just stand on the sidelines, but also keep asking questions until you really understand.
There's a nice phrase, adequacy. And it strikes me you have a mentality that asks all the whys, is it 5 whys or even more sometimes, isn't it? Why? You work problems. You work that problem until you're satisfied that problem has been worked from as many perspectives. But do you think also so many people possibly could be very good at this, but because of other constraints such as time or the sheer volume of work on them, they don't get the opportunity to be able to ask all those whys? What do? You almost, some execs I see are in constant triage mode, and they're doing their very, very best and do a fine job of it, by the way. But there's so many other sort of compounding or, satellite factors to this, Nathan, right?
The eternal dilemma, right? Because I think even if you're in an environment which is relatively stable and you're not putting out fires all the time, you're then focused on delivery. So but you're always busy. So you don't often get the time to be able to reflect on what are the systemic weaknesses or what are the systemic opportunities that we need to focus on to improve. And as a consequence, you just get on with the job, and what was the topic of interest this week, just becomes last week's news as time passes. And so you often find it's difficult to really stay focused on what the priorities are. So, but that's the important question. I think you need to constantly ask, this matter that I'm reviewing, is it ultimately going to add value to what we do within the organization? Am I spending time on an endeavor which is going to be profitable ultimately? It's not just risk for its own sake or analysis for its own sake. Engaging this activity, will it offer true value to the organization by persisting with it? And that's the answer to that, I think, is important. Well, the purpose of risk is really to have that counterbalance to the activities within the technology organization, and really to ensure that that there is keeping them accountable, of course, to what they need to do and meeting their obligations and so forth. But you also have to provide the kind of advice and insight which is going to be useful for their activities and is going to guide their activities to some sort of useful outcome.